Thank you for joining us today. Please note that there is no CPE attached to this webinar. Please view our upcoming events and webinars at cbh.com for CPE opportunities. Our presentation will begin in a moment.
Welcome to today's presentation of Evaluating Proposed Contract Prices. This webinar is presented by Terry Bekaert's Government Contracts Group, and we hope you'll find today's topic of information and useful. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Susan Moser. I'm a partner in the firm's Government Contracts Group. Along with me today, I have two of my colleagues, John Ford. John is a senior consultant with Terry Bekaert. He has been part of our Government Contracts Group for about a dozen years. Prior to that, John spent most of his career with DoD, including a number of years as a Deputy General Counsel with DCAA. In addition to John, Kurt Smith is a manager in our Government Contracts Group. Kurt, in addition to John, also spent time with DCAA. He spent about a dozen years also with DCAA as an auditor. So today's topic is really going to talk about understanding, from really the government's perspective, some of the differences in how the government evaluates your proposals. We think this is an important topic for people to understand how the government is supposed to be evaluating your proposal in different scenarios. So hopefully after the end of the seminar, you'll have a better understanding of how the government will be evaluating your proposal and if they're doing it correctly. I'll be the moderator today. John and Kurt will be providing a lot of this information. We'll kind of tag team back and forth. The broadcast today, the slides will be available after the seminar. We will send out a copy of the slides to all of the webinar participants. We've got a fair amount of information to cover today, but we will try to allow time for questions. If you do have a question you'd like to ask us, please submit the question via the chat feature. At the end of the broadcast, we will try and cover some of the questions if we have time, but we may not get a chance to cover all of the questions. If we don't answer your question today, we will provide you with a direct follow-up to your question, and if it's a question that we think would be relevant and of interest to the wider group, we will include that information also when we send out the webinar slides. So with that, I'm going to do a quick rundown of what we're going to cover today. We are going to talk about pricing objective in government procurement, really understanding the differences between price analysis and cost analysis, how the government determines price reasonableness. We're going to talk a little bit about unbalanced pricing, cost realism, and profit. So these are all terms I'm sure most of you are somewhat familiar with, so hopefully you'll learn a few things today that you may not be as familiar with. So with that, let's jump into our topic on pricing objective in government procurement. And I'm going to turn things over to John Ford to kick things off.
All right. Thanks, Susan. All right. I think most of us are familiar with the term fair and reasonable price. Well, that is the touchstone of pricing government contracts because that is the government's overall objective when pricing a contract. The FAR emphasizes that contracts are to be awarded at a fair and reasonable price. However, the FAR doesn't go into defining what is a fair and reasonable price. So that is basically a judgmental determination that's made by the contracting officer. However, the FAR does give a hint as to what is considered to be a fair and reasonable price. It is a price that encourages a contractor to perform a contract with economy and efficiency. One of the big points about a fair and reasonable price is that that doesn't mean the lowest price the government can obtain. Some of us may have had experiences with the government wanting to beat contractors down, even though the contractor has proposed a fair and reasonable price, but the government has been going after the contractor to reduce the price even further in an attempt for the government to get the lowest price that it can. but that is not the objective when pricing a contract. The objective is to get a fair and reasonable price, not necessarily the lowest price. Now, as we all know, there are various levels of competition or levels of procurement within the government. We have the micro purchase, the simplified acquisition threshold, and then we have pricing above the simplified acquisition threshold. We also have different means of procurement, such as sealed bids or negotiated procurements, and there are different ways or techniques for determining a fair and reasonable price in regard to those various contracting methods and levels of contracting. Now, in regard to the micro purchase threshold, which is procurements generally below $3,500, but for services, it's $2,500. What the FAR is saying is that micro purchases can be awarded without soliciting competitive quotes if the contracting officer considers the price to be reasonable. Now, what this contemplates is contracting officer will have done some market research, some general idea of the market, and if they go out and solicit a quote from one vendor where the contracting officer can determine that that quote provided by that one vendor is fair and reasonable. What the FAR goes on to say is in regard to these micro purchase procurements, because of the low dollar value, the FAR encourages contracting officers not to spend an inordinate amount of time trying to determine if a price is fair and reasonable, or because the cost of doing so may outweigh any savings that the government may receive as a result of contract or negotiating with the vendor over trying to get a lower price. So unless the contracting officer has some basis for believing that a price quoted by a vendor is not fair and reasonable, the FAR anticipates that price would be accepted by the contracting officer. Now, going beyond the micro purchase threshold, going into the simplified acquisition procedures, what the FAR directs contracting officers to do is, whenever possible, to base price reasonableness on competitive quotes or offers. Now, let me just pause here and make a distinction between a quote and an offer. To form a contract, there has to be an offer and acceptance by the two parties. A quote is not an offer by a contractor to enter into a contract. So for the government to get a contract as a result of issuing an RFQ, the government makes an offer to the contractor, generally in the form of a purchase order that the contractor can accept. So that is a distinction between a quotation and an offer. An offer is just what it implies, an offer by the contractor that the government can accept, but a quote is merely something for the government to be using in determining whether to make an offer to a contractor. Now then, if the government attempts to get competitive quotes but receives only one quote or response to the RFQ or the RFP, the contracting officer is to include a statement of price reasonableness in the contract file. And the FAR lists several different factors that the contracting officer can use to determine whether that single response offers a fair and reasonable price. What prices at which the item or services have been purchased in the past, market research, an IGE, or any other factor that gives reasonable assurance that the price offered is fair and reasonable.
Hey, John, one
Yes.
thing this reminded me of is we recently had a situation with a client who had responded to a request for quote to provide some items. They submitted their price, and they then subsequently found out that the government awarded a contract to another bidder, and we were sort of scratching our heads on how did they go from issuing a quote when there was clearly two parties, because they responded and the government attempted to award a contract with somebody else. They went from, requesting a quote to a contract. We did find out, right, that the government did do that improperly, and our client did file a protest, and the government did realize their error, and they did cancel that, and now they're doing a do-over, if you will. So that is a good example of government improperly issued a request for quote and then directly tried to follow with a contract incorrectly.
Correct. A contract cannot be made directly as a result of a quote, because basic contract law, you've got to have offer and acceptance, and there was no offer when a quote was made. And when Susan said that the client filed a protest, that was one of many grounds for the protest, and the government decided to take corrective action without even filing a contracting officer's report. When the government got the protest, they immediately decided to take corrective action. So they recognized the error of their ways. Okay. Now, moving ahead, getting beyond the simplified acquisition procedures, we get into sealed bids. A lot of us probably have not had occasion to be dealing with sealed bids, but the FAR does provide for contracts to be awarded competitively using sealed bids, and this type of a procurement procedure is used substantially in regard to construction contracts as well as some other types of contracts. A little bit of background about sealed bidding procurements. Sealed bids, when sealed bids are used, the resulting contract is not going to be subject to the CAS, FAR Part 31 for evaluating the prices proposed, or a requirement to submit certified cost or pricing data. When sealed bid contracts are used, only firm fixed price contracts or fixed price economic price adjustment contracts can be awarded under a sealed bid procedures, and the contract is going to be awarded based only on price and price-related factors. Now, there are various considerations that a contracting officer has to go through in determining whether to use sealed bids or whether sealed bids are appropriate or not. And the FAR says that time permits the solicitation, submission, and evaluation of sealed bids. Now, that usually the evaluation of sealed bids is done rather quickly because they are opened publicly. And when you open the sealed bids, everybody knows who is the lowest bidder. And so essentially, once those bids are opened publicly, whoever has the low bid is the one that's going to get the award if they are a responsible contractor. Another factor is it's not going to be necessary to conduct negotiations. In other words, the government's requirements are well defined and well stated in the solicitation so that offerors or bidders will know exactly what the government wants and can provide a fixed price in regard to those well-defined requirements. So those are a couple of the factors that are used in determining whether to use sealed bids. Now, when sealed bids are used, the award is made to the lowest price responsive bidder. Now, responsive bidder, what that means is someone who submits a price proposal that accepts all the terms of the solicitation. When using sealed bids, negotiations are not permitted. In determining whether there is a reasonable price that has been offered by the bidders, what the FAR says that the price analysis techniques in FAR 15404-1 may be used as guidelines. In other words, they are not required to be used. But generally, when sealed bids are used, if the prices are consistent with one another and are not inconsistent with the government's IGE, the lowest price will be considered to be a fair and reasonable price. Now then, if one issue comes up, and that is where only a single bid has been received, in those circumstances, the procurement can be converted from a sealed bid procedure to a negotiation procedure. And we'll talk a little bit about that. If you convert sealed bid to negotiations as a result of only one bid being received, that means that procurement may then be subject to the cost of pricing data. The CAS may come into play, and also the cost principles may be used to evaluate that particular bid when you have a conversion from sealed bid to negotiations. And the FAR also talks about using sealed bids in determining price reasonableness is to consider whether bids are materially unbalanced. And we're going to talk more about that a little later. So the key is in regard to if you're participating in a sealed bid procedure, because negotiations are not going to take place and you're going on a competitive procedure, you've really got to take a sharp pencil to your bid if this is one that contract that you want to get, because you're really basically only going to get one shot at getting the contract, and that is when you submit your initial bid. So you've got to really be careful about how you're pricing it out and to make sure that you're not putting any fat in there. All right, now I will turn it over to Kurt, and he is going to talk a little bit about price reasonableness, which I mentioned a minute ago about doing an evaluation of sealed bids where price reasonableness can be used procedures can be used as a guideline.
Okay, thank you, John, very much. In terms of determining price reasonableness, FAR 15 provides guidance on contracting by negotiation. And it's used when one or more of the factors for sealed bidding are not present. There's basically two techniques for evaluating a proposed price, price analysis and cost analysis. And the purpose of performing cost or price analysis is to develop a negotiation position that provides the parties an opportunity to reach agreement on a fair and reasonable price. Such a price does not require agreement on every element of cost, nor is it mandatory that the agreed price be within the contracting officer's initial negotiation position, but there must be an agreement. The contracting officer's primary concern is the overall price the government will actually pay. So let's just drill down a bit into price analysis. We'll come back to cost analysis in just a bit. So determining price reasonableness as a result of price analysis is the process of examining and evaluating a proposed price without evaluating its separate cost elements or the proposed profit. Price analysis is used to evaluate proposed prices when certified cost or pricing data are not required to be submitted. The government may not require the submission of certified cost or pricing data when using sealed bidding, generally on contracts with an anticipated value of less than $2 million, but in no case where the contract value does not exceed the simplified acquisition threshold, when prices are based on adequate price competition, on contracts for the acquisition of commercial items, when prices are set by law or regulation, or when a waiver has been granted by the head of the contracting activity.
Yeah.
So a couple points on this, because one of the, I think, key takeaways that we want everyone to understand today is really understanding when the government should use price analysis versus cost analysis. One of the things, what we're going to talk about, the criteria of when the government is appropriate to use cost analysis, but one of the things that we most often find, and I'm sure some of you have experienced too, is situations where the government should be conducting price analysis because of some of the requirements that Kurt just covered, but maybe the people in procurement are used to doing procurements that require cost analysis, and so they want to try to do cost analysis when it's not appropriate. So I think the points that Kurt made are really good for everyone to understand of when the government should be doing price analysis versus cost analysis. And in the case where they start asking for information on individual cost elements, that's when you should know to push back.
Can I just add, one thing? That's about cost or pricing data. Cost or pricing data, I have to go back and be sure of this, but the statute was changed a couple of years ago, changing when certified cost or pricing data would be required. Right now, the FAR is in the process of being amended to incorporate the new changes. However, most agencies have issued deviations to what is in the FAR. For example, DOD has issued a class deviation. The Department of Energy has. The Civilian Agency Acquisition Council has issued a class deviation to when certified cost or pricing data would be required for permitting all civilian agencies to use the $2 million threshold. So don't get confused on that about if you look at the FAR and see something 750,000 or some other figure, be aware that the deviations are there.
Yeah. Can I ask a simple question? What is the difference between certified cost or pricing data and other than certified cost or pricing data?
Because they look really similar.
And in my experience, just my experience alone, it's the lack of certification.
Correct.
Okay.
And there are different consequences to it. For example, if you have to submit certified cost or pricing data, and that certified cost or pricing data is defective, the government discovers the defective certified cost or pricing data, the government is entitled to a price adjustment. If you submit data other than certified cost or pricing data and it is defective, the government is not entitled to a price adjustment.
Okay, and a defective pricing situation would be where it is not current, accurate, and complete.
Correct.
Okay. Okay, so
as of the date of agreement on price.
Okay. Let's keep going here. Determining price reasonableness as a result of price analysis. FAR 15-4041 lists 7 examples of techniques that can be used to evaluate a price proposal. Among these techniques are comparison of proposed prices received in response to the solicitation. Normally, adequate price competition establishes a fair and reasonable price. Comparison of proposed prices to historical prices paid, whether by the government or other than the government, for the same or similar items. This method may be used for commercial items, including those of a type or requiring minor modifications. The third is comparison of proposed prices with independent government cost estimates. The first 2 techniques are the preferred techniques. The fact is, however, the government frequently uses the IGE as the baseline for measuring reasonableness. And John, we were discussing previously where a government may receive several proposals and perhaps the prices are in a cluster, somewhat close to one another, but the government has an IGE that is lower and goes straight to the IGE rather than considering the prices proposed by various
Correct.
offers. Okay.
Right. And unfortunately, in those situations, most times the government will think that it's the contractor at fault, instead of looking back to look at the solicitation to see if the requirements are well stated, or going back to review the IGE to see if the IGE was properly prepared or took into account all the factors that would be attributable to a price that's higher than what the government put in their IGE. So there are a lot of reasons why the government IGE may not be consistent with prices received in a competitive proposal. And one thing that I always, when I worked for DCAA, one of the things we always had to impart to the auditors there at DCAA headquarters was that nobody knows the contractor's business better than the contractor.
This is correct. This is correct. And I've worked with many auditors that feel otherwise.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so the FAR does not mention a price realism analysis requirement. However, agencies are only required to conduct a price realism analysis if the solicitation requires one. And a price realism analysis is conducted to evaluate the risk of a contractor not being able to complete the contract at the price proposed. So this is a little different. We'll see in cost analysis where cost realism analysis is pursued frequently in acquisitions. But with price analysis, it's typically not part of the process. I think you mentioned earlier in the conversation, John, that if it's in the solicitation and price analysis is used, then the agency will conduct a price realism analysis. But otherwise, typically, they won't.
Right. Even though a lot of contractors, I've seen a lot of bid protests to the GAO where the contractor is protesting the award to somebody else, saying that, and the basis of the protest is that the agency did not do a price realism analysis before making the award, and inevitably, those protests are denied.
So I think that's a good point for everyone is if the solicitation under the requirements where the government is only doing price analysis, unless it is explicit in the RFP that they will be doing a price realism analysis, that is not grounds for a protest.
Correct.
So save your money on that one.
Yeah.
There may be other grounds, but not that one.
Okay. Unbalanced pricing. Unbalanced pricing is where the price of one or more line items is significantly over or understated. And the issue with unbalanced pricing is it may increase performance risk. Basically, unit prices should reflect the intrinsic value of the item or service and should be in proportion to an item's base cost. Obviously, when you have unbalanced pricing, that is a little out of kilter, if you will, or out of proportion. All offers with separately priced line items shall be analyzed to determine if the prices are unbalanced, and this is true of every acquisition. An offer may be rejected if the contracting officer determines that the lack of balance poses an unacceptable risk to the government. So, just a quick comment here, suppose labor is severely understated. Obviously, that would present a great risk to the government because labor being the most significant cost in any contract, the performance risk could be at stake by a contractor trying to attain this low proposed labor cost or labor price. And the fact is they cannot perform the contract at that price. So unbalanced pricing sort of finds these things out, if you will.
And let me just make a point about that because in the Section M criteria of the RFP, it'll tell you how the government's going to analyze your proposal. And in the situation where just say you had multiple line items and the evaluation criteria says the government is going to evaluate the overall price. And so one might think, okay, well in that situation, if I have, several line items, it doesn't really matter because they're just looking at my overall price. But as Kurt mentioned, you need to be aware of that. So if you have any, throwaway lines that you're really not paying attention to and you think you've got the cost covered in another line item, you want to make sure that on the surface that is not the case, and so that the government would not think that there is unbalanced pricing.
Cost analysis. Okay, John, I'm going to let you run with that.
Okay, thanks, Kurt. All right, cost analysis, talk about when it's going to be used. It's going to be used to evaluate reasonableness of individual cost elements in a proposal when certified cost or pricing data are required. Now, of course, it can also be used when data other than certified cost or pricing data are required by the solicitation or post submission of proposals. So the key to cost analysis is that the government is looking at the individual cost elements in your proposal, your labor, your material, your overhead costs, your G&A, all of these elements, these cost elements are evaluated when cost analysis is done. Profit is not evaluated in a cost analysis. That's a separate analysis that the government is doing. So cost analysis deals only with cost. And we talked a little bit earlier about when contractors are required to submit certified cost or pricing data. But one of the things we have to understand is the format for submission of certified cost or pricing data. And in FAR 15408, we will find table 15.2. And table 15.2 of the FAR is captioned Instructions for Submission of Certified Cost or Pricing Data. And it gives you a format to be used in submitting your cost or pricing data. The government can permit contractors to submit cost or pricing data in a different format, or a format different from the one that's specified in 15.2, but that has to be specified in the solicitation. So if the solicitation doesn't tell you that you can use your own format, you will be required to submit certified cost or pricing data using table 15.2. So as we said, cost analysis can also be used to evaluate prices when data other than certified cost or pricing data are provided. Now, the FAR lists 6 techniques for conducting cost analysis. One of the techniques is to verify that the proposal is in accordance with the cost principles and the CAS. Exactly what in accordance with means is not described or defined in the FAR. We have to look at that just a bit to realize that these proposal analysis techniques that are described in the FAR are techniques that the government is going to be using to evaluate proposals. These techniques do not tell contractors how they are to structure their proposals. That is done in Section L of a solicitation, instructions to offerors, and also offerors can utilize Section M of a competitive solicitation to get ideas about how to submit or structure their proposal. So exactly what does in accordance with the cost principles mean if you're having or proposing on a firm fixed price contract where what you're being paid is not determined by the cost principles? But anyway, that is one thing that you have to keep in mind, is that this technique can be used by the government. And we're going to talk more about this in accordance with. Now, FAR 31103, which is part of the cost principles, states that the cost principles and procedures are to be used in pricing contracts whenever cost analysis is performed. Again, this is guidance to contracting officers, not guidance to contractors. And in regard to firm fixed price contracts, FAR 31102 says that the applicable parts of Part 31 are to be used in pricing of fixed price contracts whenever cost analysis is performed, i.e. when certified cost or pricing data or data other than certified cost or pricing data are required. Now, 102 goes on to state that the government doesn't have to reach agreement with the contractor on every element of cost that is being included within a proposal for a fixed price contract, firm fixed price contract. But again, the government's objective when pricing out a firm fixed price contract is to pay or agree to a fair and reasonable price. So that is all within FAR 31102 in providing guidance in regard to how the cost principles apply in regard to evaluating proposals for firm fixed price contracts. And again, that is the government. So you should be keeping this in mind when you're submitting your price proposals. Now, coming back to 15.2 and this in accordance with the cost principles, Table 15.2, if you have to submit your proposal, your cost or pricing data using the format specified in Table 15.2, that requires you to state whether your proposal are consistent, or is consistent with Part 31, and if not, to provide an explanation. If you're bidding or proposing on a firm fixed price contract and your proposal includes unallowable costs, you would have to explain, and there's no prohibition, let me make this clear, there's no prohibition against a contractor including unallowable costs in a proposal for a firm fixed price contract. That's a negotiation issue.
So, John, a couple points on that. So, I hear what you're saying,
Yeah.
but whether the government folks understand that is probably a different scenario. So,
Particularly auditors.
Right. Some of that's an education process. One of the other things that you mentioned that I just wanted to highlight is this idea of the government doing cost analysis in a fixed price scenario. So for some of you, you may be hearing that and thinking, I can't see where that ever comes into play. And so when Kurt covered the topics of what was the decision factors that the government uses when they do price analysis, one of those is when there's adequate price competition. So in a situation where you have a fixed price procurement, there is expected to be adequate price competition. Generally, you're never going to see the government doing cost analysis. They shouldn't be doing that.
Right, cost or pricing.
But where we do see this, and we see it fairly often, is in situations where there is limited or there is no competition. So whether this is a small business, maybe it's a small 8A set-aside for a fixed price under the sole source award threshold, or if a contractor has the government is issuing some sole source justification because they provide some very specific product or service that only they can provide, and so the government is going to award that on sole source, even if it's fixed price. That would be a situation where the government would and should do cost analysis. So it's important for people to understand. There are situations, certainly, when cost analysis is done on a fixed price basis.
Right. If certified cost or pricing data is required, or if data other than certified cost or pricing data has been required, the government will more than likely do cost analysis in regard to that data, the certified cost or pricing data, or the data other than, to determine price reasonableness.
Yep.
And DOD is really has put out some really strange guidance in the last few years in this, really wanting to get the certified cost of pricing data or data other than in determining price reasonableness.
All right, so let's switch and talk a little bit about cost realism.
All right. Now, we've been talking about cost or price analysis being done. Cost analysis is done when certified cost or pricing data is required, and this is not dependent upon the contract type. Firm fixed price, cost reimbursement, T&M, if certified cost or pricing data is required, the government will generally wind up doing cost analysis to determine whether the proposed prices are fair and reasonable. Cost realism is a little bit different animal. Cost realism analysis is done in regard to proposals for cost reimbursement contracts, whether cost or pricing data are required or not. They also can be used in regard to fixed price incentive contracts if the contracting officer determines that that is necessary. But primarily, cost realism analysis is done in regard to proposals for cost reimbursement contracts. And the purpose of doing a cost realism analysis is to determine if the proposed costs are realistic for the work to be performed. And that leads into the next purpose, is whether the costs reflect a clear understanding of the requirements, and to determine if the costs are consistent with the methods of performance and materials described in the offeror's proposal. What cost analysis really is a judgmental analysis that's done by the contracting officer to determine does the contractor understand what we really want? And can the contractor do the job at the cost proposed, or are we heading into a potential overrun situation, or where we're going to have to be using more money later on down the line to get this work done? So the key on this is that it is judgmental. It is not a formulaic analysis that's done by the contracting officer. So again, going back on this about bid protest, I've seen a lot of bid protests that have been done where the government or the contractor is challenging the cost realism analysis done by the government. And in doing so, to be successful, the government or the contractor is going to have to show that the government acted unreasonably or arbitrarily or capriciously in conducting the cost realism analysis. As long as the government can articulate some rational basis for the analysis that it did, the GAO is generally not going to disturb that cost realism analysis. So that's a hard row to hoe if you want to file a protest in that regard.
So a couple comments just from a practical standpoint, because this is a lot of these types of proposals are what we get involved with and help companies with. So two sort of things I would just suggest everyone pay particular attention to. So one of the things that John mentioned was cost realism analysis is intended to determine if there's a clear understanding of the requirements. One of the things that just from a practical standpoint, so you work on a proposal, typically you're going to start on the technical proposal. You got a whole team of people doing that. You really need to do that before you can figure out how you're going to price it, what are the labor categories, if you have subcontractors, who's providing what. And so just in my experience, having done many, many cost proposals, usually that sort of comes down to the wire. And oftentimes we see where you got one team of people doing the technical proposal, you got a different team of people doing the cost proposal, and sometimes what we say in the technical proposal doesn't get translated into the cost proposal. You talk about key personnel, or you talk about, how you're going to, in your management plan or your retention plan, how you're going to, keep all your employees, and then you don't have good information. Your labor pricing doesn't reflect what's in the technical. You always want to make sure that you have a couple people review the technical proposal and the cost proposal so you don't miss something, because that happens a lot. The other thing I would just say about cost realism, particularly as it relates to indirect rates, this is a situation when the government's going to do cost realism analysis. You don't want to leave the government guessing. They're going to ultimately evaluate what they think is the government's best estimate of what your real cost is going to be. And so if you're skimpy on details, if your history shows one set of indirect rates and you're proposing something else, which is perfectly acceptable to do, but you're not really careful, you're not really explaining how you got from point A to point B, then the government might not believe. They might not think that you're being realistic. So when the government is doing cost realism, I'm not usually a fan of more is better, but sometimes more is better in terms of making sure that the government has all of the data to accurately evaluate your cost proposal.
This is one thing that when you do a cost realism, when the government does a cost realism analysis, what it's going to be doing, what the government wants to do is to determine what's going to be the most probable cost to the government, just as you were indicating there. And this is how the government evaluates the proposed cost on proposals, is not necessarily the cost proposed by the contractor, but the government's adjustments that are made to cost proposed by the contractor to come up with the government's most probable cost of performance. So that's how the government makes its determination as to which proposal offers the best value to the government. It's not based on what you have proposed, but it's what the government has said is the most probable cost of performance. Some time ago, we got involved with a protest on that issue where the government had made some adjustments to the contractor's proposal, and the protest was, hey, these adjustments are totally unreasonable and not justified. Government didn't say why they had done it. So that's one thing to look for if you lose out on a cost reimbursement contract, is to look at the adjustments the government made to your proposal to determine what is the most probable cost of performance in the government's view.
Yeah. All right, let's switch. We don't have too much time left, so let's talk for a few minutes about profit.
Okay, and I know this is everybody's favorite section of the presentation, and a fact is the government actually wants contractors to make money. In other words, they want them to be profitable.
I know most of you don't believe that, but that is true.
It is true. It's even written in the FAR.
Not too profitable.
That is, shall we say, the bottom line with the government is not too profitable. So in determining price reasonableness with regard to profit analysis is only performed when cost analysis is used. Profit is not analyzed when price analysis is used. Profit or fee does not necessarily represent net income to contractors. That's a big, if you don't understand that, what that means is, there's a contract profit line that after cost, the government sees a profit number, but your other costs will come into play, your federal income taxes, for example, and other such type costs that are not represented in the contract cost itself that end in your net income. So big difference there. Contracting officers are prohibited from requiring any prospective contractor to submit breakouts or supporting rationale for its profit or fee objective. The FAR lists the following as common profit evaluation factors: contractor effort, contractor cost, risk, federal socio-economic programs, such as the 8A program, capital investments, cost control and other past accomplishments, and independent development. That was a quick run through profit. Any comments on that, or?
So a couple things on as it relates to profit. So one of the things you said was the government cannot ask for contractors to submit breakouts or supporting rationale for profit or fee objectives. While that's true, hopefully there are in the uniform guidelines, or there are in the FAR, the DFAR.
Yeah, the weighted guidelines.
The weighted guidelines. The DFAR does instruct how the government should evaluate your profit. And again, a lot of it's a function of the elements that Kurt mentioned. We recommend that everyone really be familiar with these guidelines and be prepared, especially if you're going to be in a negotiation, be prepared to defend your profit against those weighted guidelines criteria. So in some situations, we do recommend, and I think it's helpful for companies to go through that weighted guideline analysis themselves, so you have really an understanding to justify if you're going to propose a 20% profit on a fixed price contract and where the government is doing cost analysis, that you will be able to defend yourself when they say, we don't think that's reasonable because of the weighted guidelines. We think it's 10%. That's the weighted guidelines. That is while there is some objective elements of that, it is a very subjective criteria. And, often the government, they're making assumptions. They don't know your organization nearly as well as you do. And so, again, you shouldn't have to submit that to the government, but we do think it's sometimes a helpful exercise to go through. John, any other comments?
No, one thing I did just want to point out, for the DFARS guidelines, DFARS is specific that the weighted guidelines are to be used as part of an evaluation when cost of pricing data are required. So that ties back in to what Kurt was saying. The profit analysis is done on a cost analysis. So if certified cost of pricing data are required, the government would evaluate your price proposal using cost analysis and your proposed profit for DOD using the weighted guidelines to establish the government's negotiation position. But you can propose anything that you want. In that regard, for fixed price contracts, firm fixed price contracts, there is no limit on the amount of profit a contractor can propose or receive on a firm fixed price contract.
And we get asked that question a lot.
Yeah,
the government understands that. But.
However, on cost reimbursement contracts, there are limits on the amount of fee that can be negotiated in regard to cost plus fixed fee contracts, not cost plus incentive fee or cost plus award fee contracts. There are no limits on cost plus incentive fee or cost plus award fee contracts, only fixed fee.
Yeah, good point. And with that, we are about out of time. So unfortunately, we will not have time to cover questions. I did get a couple while we were talking today. We will follow up directly on those questions. So if you do have questions, I'm sorry we were not able to answer those, but we will follow up. Again, on the screen, you have our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us. We help companies with all different types of problems and issues that go along with the government as your customer. We hope this was helpful to you. And like I said, we will be sending out a copy of our slides today. Thank you.